Good afternoon. You know, speaking truth to power has been a challenge from the Old Testament world of Nathan and Esther to the New Testament with John the Baptist and Herod Antipas, among others. In England, when Sir Thomas More spoke truth to King Henry VIII and, like John the Baptist, lost his head. And throughout more modern times, including 20th and 21st century world leaders. Indeed, speaking truth to power is dangerous. But we're grateful you have chosen to join us for the Keston Spring Lecture, Speaking Truth to Power, the Revolt of a Russian Priest, and a reception and book signing that follows. I'm Kathy Hillman, Director of the Keston Center for Religion, Politics, and Society at Baylor, which is located, if you have never been there, on the third floor of the Carroll Library. Perhaps you're wondering what Keston is and why Baylor. The Keston Institute was founded during the Cold War in 1969 in England by the Reverend Canon Dr. Michael Bordeaux, an Anglican priest. 10 years earlier, in 1959, as an Oxford University student, Michael took part in the very first exchange program between Great Britain and the Soviet Union. While studying at Moscow University, he witnessed the start of Nikita Khrushchev's anti-religious campaign. On a later visit, Michael saw further destruction of churches, learned of religious persecution, and met believers who asked him, and I quote, to be our voice where we cannot be heard. Bordeaux took up their call to be the voice of the voiceless. He established the Center for the Study of Religion and Communism, along with others, including Xenia Denon, chair of the Council of Management of what has later become Keston College or Keston Institute. We're grateful that Chair Denon is with us today from London. Xenia, would you please stand and face the audience? And by the way, most of my remarks are plagiarized with permission from Xenia. Keston gathered reliable information about the situation with all religions and documented the persecution and fight by dissident believers in the countries of the now former communist bloc and under other totalitarian regimes. A vast library and unique archive formed Keston's core, and the Keston News Service produced authenticated reports that effectively exerted political pressure. With the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, the organization experienced a decline in donations. In 2003, the news service ceased, and the search began for a location for Keston's stunning collection on religious persecution and religious freedom. That included not only books and periodicals, but photographs, significant archival and audiovisual items, illegally published materials known as samizdat, propaganda posters, art, trial transcripts, and much more, written in at least 33 different languages and encompassing more than 30 different discrete denominations and religions. Oxford's Keston Institute accepted Baylor's proposal, largely done by and pressured by Baylor, right? Dr. Wallace Daniel, who knew a good thing and we should go after it. So thank you so much, Dr. Daniel. And in 2007, Keston UK passed the library and archives to the newly created Keston Center to work with Keston UK to preserve the resources and to promote research, teaching, and understanding of religion and religious persecution under communism and other totalitarian regimes, and to continue to be a voice of the voiceless. This lecture is part of Keston's legacy that today, just as then, includes speaking truth to power across the world. Keston scholar and chair of Baylor's History Department, Dr. Julia de Graffenried, who serves on Keston's advisory board, will introduce today's participants.
Thank you, Kathy, so much. I am delighted to introduce our moderator and our guest speaker today. So our moderator for the post-talk conversation is my colleague, Dr. Stephen Sloan, professor of history and director of Baylor's multiple award-winning Institute for Oral History. In addition to being the executive director of the National Oral History Association, a past president of Historic Waco Foundation, the creator of the Waco History app and podcast, a Cornelia Marshall Smith Award winner, and Big 12 Faculty Member of the Year. I know, it's kind of gross, isn't it? Dr. Sloan is also a prolific award-winning oral historian. So oral historians generate interviews that serve as primary source materials for themselves and for other scholars. So in short, Dr. Sloan gets paid to make people talk, which is why he is the ideal candidate to facilitate a conversation with our guest speaker after his talk today. So thank you, Stephen, in advance for your participation today. Thanks. And now to our speaker. So the year was 1971. And legendary history professor Dr. Ralph Lynn put it this way: a cute, young Russian history professor showed up at Baylor. You're welcome. With a freshly minted PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. After achieving tenure, Dr. Daniel went on to become the director of the Slavic Studies program and then Baylor's honors program. Simultaneously, which seems to defy any logic, he chaired the Department of History for 5 years. And along the way, amongst all of those things, he was a 3-time Fulbrighter to the Soviet Union. He won an Outstanding Professor Award for teaching at Baylor. He was a charter member of Baylor's hard-won Phi Beta Kappa chapter, and he was named the Ralph L. and Bessie May Lynn Professor of History. And then he became the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, where he served for about a decade, and like Kathy said, helped to bring the Keston Archive and Library to Baylor in that capacity, also helped to create the BIC, among lots of other things. He received the Cornelia Marshall Smith Award as well, so we're gonna have 2 Cornelia Marshall Smiths talking to each other, which probably means something will explode, I don't know, during the conversation. And then he left to become provost at Mercer University in Macon, Georgia. He was named Distinguished University Professor of History in 2012, and it was at that moment that he apparently thought, I've got a dozen more books to write. On a more personal note, Wallace is the reason that I am standing here introducing him to you today. As an 18-year-old sophomore at Baylor, in the fall of 1990, I took his History 3340, Russia to 1861 survey, and that dynamic, rigorous introduction to Russia, in combination with a trip that I took that semester to the Soviet Union, quite simply changed my life. I added a Slavic Studies major to my history major. I took every course that he taught. He became my honors thesis advisor, and I defended a thesis comparing the writings and experiences of Alexandra Kollontai, Yevgenia Ginsburg, and Irina Ratushinskaya. How about that? Yeah, that's wild. Yeah, that's a feat right there. When I came back to Baylor as an adjunct in 2001, Wallace was the dean, and I have to tell you how completely surreal and mind-blowing it was to walk into the very same classroom as an instructor where I had taken Wallace as a student. Notes from his class were the foundations for my own class. His gentility and grace in dealing with me helped me understand how to relate to my own students. His perceptiveness shaped and sharpened my own scholarship. And I'm pretty sure that the reason I look at the ceiling when I'm thinking, see, if you know, is because I watched him look at the ceiling a lot while I was talking to him. He has continued to be a source of wisdom and great humor and encouragement to me over the years, always patient, unfailingly kind, and forever curious. And I am so grateful to have the public opportunity to say thank you. All that to say, oh yeah, you can clap. Wallace Daniel is the consummate historian. He was always a superb teacher and mentor. And with the publication of his last 3 books, all in the last 9 years, which is insane for a historian, I just want to point out, he has become the foremost scholar of dissident orthodoxy during the Soviet era, refining and redefining how we talk about religious freedom. There is actually no more relevant scholar-teacher that Keston could possibly bring as its speaker. So please help me welcome my mentor and my colleague and my friend, Dr. Wallace Daniel.
Thank you, Dr. Graffenreid, for those very kind words, even though I don't recognize the person she's describing. Thank you very, very much. I know what you're thinking. If he was cute, what's happened to him? But let me do say, it's an honor to be invited to speak here this afternoon. This is almost like a homecoming to me, having taught at Baylor for so many years. I want to express appreciation to you for coming today and to express appreciation to so many of my former students and students who are here today, present students, and so many friends and so many members of the community. So thank you. I'm very grateful to you. I also want to thank Kathy Hillman and Zania Denham, the chairperson of the Keston Institute in London, as well as Dean Jeffrey Walden, Dean of Libraries, and Dr. de Graffenreid, of course, all of whom have made enormous contributions to Keston and what it has become, in my mind, the major archive in the world on freedom of conscience and on religious freedom. That's what is here at Baylor. In the United States, and indeed throughout the Western world, there's the widespread view that the Russian people are essentially authoritarian by nature. They worship a strong central government, a government that tells them what to do, what to think, how to act, and what to be. In such a world, it is generally believed freedom of conscience does not exist, or if it does exist, it exists in very low esteem. Freedom of religion, it is again often considered that it is not part of Russia's tradition, never has been part of tradition. That is really a misconception. If one looks very carefully at Russian history, at the flow of Russian history, one will see many examples of nonconformists and of dissidents and of people who do not agree with the state. One needs to just remember dissenting Baptists or the group called the Mullahkhans, or a famous group called the Old Believers, or many of the most violent peasant rebellions in modern European history that attempted and almost did on several occasions overthrow the state. One must remember these, as well as many activists and thinkers and writers who disagreed with the regime and who said so. So the general conception in my mind is nothing other than a Western construct. It doesn't hold true to the reality. Today, I'm going to talk about the most courageous, one of the most courageous and one of the most outstanding of those nonconformists, those dissidents, whose name is Father Gleb Yakunin, and whose story I've tried to tell in my recent book. I've been fascinated with him since I first encountered him several years ago. Who was Gleb Yakunin, and why did he become a Russian Orthodox priest? Let me set the stage just a moment in order to set this up. Rather than look at the ceiling, I now look at the floor. I think I need to set the stage just a moment and say that Father Gleb fought for freedom of conscience in some of the most difficult conditions that one can imagine through some of the darkest years of Soviet Russia and its history. As you remember, right after the Bolsheviks came to power in 1917, Lenin, the leader, Vladimir Lenin, the leader, decreed war on religion. Religion is the belief of the naive, the people who are peasant-oriented. We need to overcome this, his argument was, in order to create the kind of civilization that we want to create, a scientific and industrial civilization. The way to do this, Lenin said, was to attack Christianity in all its forms, and to attack it both from the outside and also from the inside of the religious tradition. Now, in that framework, let me show you something that I think will demonstrate what I have in mind. This is Gleb Yakunin as a student. If you look at this cartoon, this famous cartoon that appeared in the Bolshevik magazine Biz Bodnik, The Atheist, notice that in this cartoon, there's the new Soviet man climbing a ladder. He's holding a giant, hard hammer in his hand. And if you don't happen to read Russian, the caption reads, at the top, it reads, "We have conquered the gods on earth, and now it is our turn to conquer the gods in heaven." And you see across the top, you see characters of Yahweh and Jehovah, and there's one of Jesus Christ, and there's one of Satan on there. He's going after them now. And down at the bottom, notice across the bottom of the cartoon, notice that the churches at the bottom are in shambles. They're despoiled, and that rising above them and also are industrial factories, the new science, the new organization as it was. Now, let me go back a moment. Gleb Yakunin was born in 1934. By the way, he died in 2014, so he's fairly contemporary, just to put that date out there for a moment. But he was born in 2034 in Moscow in very difficult circumstances. To talk about his family just a moment. His father was a concert musician, was a great violinist. The father grew up in Ukraine. His wife was a bookkeeper. And during the Second World War, when the largest army in European history invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, the family, like other families in Moscow, went into the interior of the country to protect their children, settled in the interior. Several years later, the father, really wanting to get his job back as a concert musician, decided to go back to Moscow and look for a job as a concert musician. He did not succeed. He left the family in the hinterland, did not succeed. And so he took a job as a construction worker. He was not up to it. He had suffered a heart attack, and he died in 1943, leaving the mother to raise a 9-year-old child. They came back in 1945 at the end of the war, and again, very difficult circumstances. The mother, I should tell you, was very religious. She was in church, in the Orthodox Church, every chance she got. If one went into the apartment of the mother, one saw lamps, lighted lamps everywhere from the church, icons along the wall, And Gleb, as a child, this child was grown up in those conditions. But he was also grown up in another world. He also grew up in another world, and that is the world of school. School was atheistic, and atheism, of course, was the order of the day. The teachers were required to teach atheism, and he was required, as other students were, to take courses in atheism. At the age of 14, Father Gleb Yakunin decreed himself to be an avowed atheist, someone he said he would never change. But he did change. And there are several reasons why he did change in his 20s. First of all, he encountered a remarkable man by the name of Alexander Min, who was also a student. When Gleb Yakunin graduated from the secondary school, he wanted to study the sciences, as did most Soviet youth at that time. He wanted to study the sciences, and so did Alexander Min. So they both wound up in a school on the outskirts of Moscow called the Zoological Institute. This Zoological Institute, they both attended. They did not know each other when they signed up, but one day on the train, as he was going back from visiting his mother, Gleb Yakunin encountered this fellow student named Alexander Min, and it is going to shape his life or reshape his life. He had this dream of becoming a hunter, a wildlife hunter, of going into the wilderness, of hunting wild game, of sitting around at night around a campfire, telling stories, eating food, maybe drinking a little bit, and telling lots of stories. Anyway, on that train, Yakunin met Alexander Min. Min was sitting in a corner. They both loved books. They both were voracious leaders. They both had an interest in the sciences. They both had an interest in world religions. And thus is going to begin a long-term friendship that is going to change Gleb Yakunin from being a staunch atheist to something else. What he told me at that point, what he said was, I was on my way then. I was already on my way to becoming something else, perhaps a Christian. I hadn't gone there yet, but I took an interest in Christianity. Now, after the Institute in 1955 moved to Irkutsk, Siberia, Irkutsk, you know, this main city on the Trans-Siberian Railroad, about halfway across Siberia. Irkutsk is famous for its study as a biological center, a zoological center, I should say. The Institute moved there so it could study zoology. It could study particularly sables. Sables, as you know at that time, or may know at that time, was a very precious fur and sold at high prices on the world market. And it moved there. And there, Yakunin roomed with Alexander Min. Alexander Min is later to become one of the great theological minds of the 20th century. Here's an older picture, a picture when Min was a bit older, over on this side, on this close side. You may recognize Alexander Solzhenitsyn on the other side of the picture. He roomed with Min, and their friendship is going to have a very large impact on Gleb Yakunin. He convinced Yakunin that there was a much deeper and more interesting world than he had been exposed to in his schooling. And in some ways, it's going to totally change Gleb Yakunin's mind. In addition, Yakunin had an inquiring mind. He was always a reader. He scoured Moscow's bookstores for antiquarian books, for books out of print, for books that were controversial. And you could find them then. You can still find some of them today. He was especially interested, as I've said several times, in Eastern religions, and he particularly looked for books of that nature. Finally, and I think the third reason he's going to change, is that he was a rebel. He was a nonconformist himself. The Bolshevik Party, the communists, he came to believe, was living in a fantasy world with its ideology, its desire to create heaven on earth, its cult of a leader, its requirement that people bow down before authority, its slavish devotion to power. All of these, he came to be convinced, were wrong. I was born a fighter, he said, and he chose a vocation that perhaps would exemplify the fighter of them all, vocation of being a priest at the age of 26, and at that age, he was ordained. When Gleb Yakunin became a priest in the 1960s, in his 20s, he was practically unknown in the Western world, in this country particularly. He's going to change, and this is going to become a world figure for 2 or 3 reasons. First, because of an infamous letter that he and a friend of his, Nikolai Eshleman, another priest, is going to send to the Patriarch, Alexei I. This letter, when it reached the West, was astounding. Here was a voice coming from within the church that was critical of the church and critical of authority. There's more to be said about that, but to pass on quickly, 10 years passed, and then another letter, and this time to the World Council of Churches in 1975. That letter was also astounding. He talked about religious persecution, and he talked about the need for the brothers and sisters of Christianity to come to the aid of Christians who were suffering in the Soviet Union. That letter, again, was astounding that this was coming out of the Soviet Union. And then I have to mention the third item that is really going to shake a lot of people. The third item took place a year later in 1976. The last day of the year, on December the 31st, Gleb Yakunin announced a press conference in Moscow. And at that press conference, to whom were invited Western journalists and also Soviet journalists, at that press conference in 1976, they announced the creation of a, quote, Christian Committee for the Defense of Believers' Rights in the Soviet Union. Now, our purpose, he said, in that committee was to collect stories of priests and stories also of believers who were being persecuted. A lot of these stories were collected, something like 461 of them. There were over 2,000 pages of these stories. They were sent to San Francisco, where they were published by a very interesting man named Henry Dakin, an entrepreneur in San Francisco. These stories were published in 12 volumes on a desktop computer, which in 1976 was something of a revolution. These stories were circulated. We have 9 volumes over there in the Keston collection in Carroll Library. I must tell you that when I held these volumes in my hand and read those stories of people, they really, really shook me emotionally. It was really an experience to hold those stories right there. And they're right here on this campus. The rest of them, the other 3, are at Stanford University in Palo Alto, California. Anyway, there are a lot of stories that I wish I had time to tell there, but moving on quickly. All of these actions, the 2 letters, the committee, and what it did, all of those actions are going to make a world figure out of Gleb Yakunin. Several themes ran through these stories, through all 3 of those examples. First, he decried the fantasy that the Orthodox Church and the Soviet government had spun when they said there was no religious persecution in the Soviet Union. He confronted that fantasy. He confronted it head on, and he showed it with facts, not propaganda, but actual stories, actual facts, as it were. The facts he brought to light showed that religious persecution was widespread. Second, Yakunin had no fear of asserting truth to power, of confronting the hierarchy of the church, the power elite, of confronting the government, of violating the Soviet Constitution. In so doing, he knew that what he was doing was extremely dangerous, and he would ultimately have to pay a heavy price for doing that. He knew that, and still he did it. And third, Yakunin believed wholeheartedly in freedom of conscience, of a person's right to believe or not to believe according to one's own conscience, the dictates of one's own conscience. This came from his religion, a belief that he held from his own religious tradition, that it was a person's right to believe or not to believe, not to be told what to do, but what one's conscience, what one's heart told one to do. He also said that when Christianity and nationalism become entwined with each other, when the mind becomes captive to power, a person and a whole society will lose their way. Now, let me go quickly to him as a priest, and also to his family, which I hope to be able to talk about a bit later. Let me just say that his acts did not come free to him and his family. But skipping over all of that, to conclude, what Father Gleb Yakunin discovered and made public was corruption and duplicity at the very highest level. To be healthy, he said, a society needed to look at its own history, need to look at every part of its history, not to be afraid to do so, to bring it out, to look at these parts of it. It should not be afraid to uncover the full elements of its story, to bring them out in clarity. Truth, not duplicity, nor fantasy, would cleanse us, he believed. Speaking the truth, he saw as his Christian duty, his calling. That statement is as relevant to Putin's Russia today as it was when Yakunin wrote these words. It is also relevant to our own country, to healing its wounds, to bringing us together again as a people. Keep up the tradition of looking at the floor.
Thank you so much, Dr. Daniel. And if I'm going to have a conversation with him, and if you want to look at the ceiling, I want you to go ahead. I'm sorry she put you under that scrutiny. Now they're all looking for that. But I'll say thank you. I'll add my thank you. When I came back as a master's student that had an accounting degree and was entering the history world in the 1990s, Dr. Daniel welcomed me into his home as chair and made me realize that I was doing the right thing. So I want to thank you as well for that personally. I'm going to have a conversation, and then you be thinking of questions that you would like to ask Dr. Daniel here in a little bit, and then Kathy will be back up to give us some instructions. There's food and books after this, so there's more to come. Father Gleb, as you've talked about him, is a well-recognized figure among many people, both in Eastern Europe, in Russia, and at one time very controversial person among Russian Orthodox groups in the U.S. What led to you at this time wanting to write this book about this individual?
Am I okay? Can you hear okay? When I was writing my book on Alexander Min, Father Alexander Min, this theologian, this wonderful, wonderful person who was murdered by I think, the KGB in 1990. When I was writing that book, I went to do the research, and everywhere I turned, I kept coming across the name of Gleb Yakunin, friend of Alexander Min's. Who was this person? Why is he so important? Why is he ostracized so heavily? Why is he not better known? What were his real motivations? And I began to look into that because I was working on Alexander Min. The other reason is that I had a really chance encounter. A friend of mine, a friend of several of us in this room, Elena Volkova, a Russian friend and a sort of admirer of Father Gleb Yakunin, invited me to meet with him in her apartment. And so I went with these images in mind that I was going to meet with a firebrand, that here was a person who was unafraid to confront anything, who was hard-minded, who was considered self-important. I'd read all the propaganda that the Soviet government put out about him. I found absolutely the opposite. I found a gentle person, a bit of a gleam in his eyes, a sort of smile on his face when he talked, a person who didn't take himself that seriously, who was friendly, and very open. I think I had a 4-hour conversation with him, and I asked him all kinds of questions about Alexander Min, but he also told me about himself a bit. At the end of that conversation, somebody in the room, there's another priest in the room, said to Father Gleb, "Why don't you write your story, your own book?" He said, "I'm not interested in doing that. I was never someone to sit down like that and write my story. I don't want to do that. I want to think about the future." He said, "I hope someday someone will write my story." That's where it came from.
That's amazing. That's really amazing. One of the things that you mentioned in there that I think would be interesting, you talk about this declaration of a war on religion, but as Father Gleb operated, how closely is the KGB monitoring his activities? And that larger question I think that would be interesting is this concern security forces have with the church and how it's evolving in the 60s, 70s, and 80s.
First of all, to take the first part of that question, the KGB constantly had him under surveillance. And this committee that I mentioned a moment ago, this committee, they several times, members of the KGB told him that they need to cease and desist. They need to stop collecting these stories. And they watched him as he sent these across the borders. As I said, to San Francisco. How'd they get out? They were smuggled out on little rolls of microfilm. Sometimes tourists took them out. Sometimes certain individuals took them. There was a diplomatic pouch, as you may know, that in which you could freely take things around, ship them out without inspection. And there was also certain people, like the wife of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, Natalia Solzhenitsyn, who agreed to take a few microfilm rolls out. Very courageous, actually. But he was watched very, very carefully. And as I said, it eventually is going to come down on him. It's going to come down on him hard. Arrest him in 1979, in November of 1979, after constant warnings that he should cease and desist this activity. And so in 1979, in November, he was arrested. He was tried in June of 1980. 1980 was the time of the Olympic Games that was to be held in Moscow. We boycotted those names, as some of you may know. But that trial was in 1980 in the summer, and the court, which was really sort of a scandalous court, convicted him of 5 years of prison in a notorious Pelham 37 labor camp, and 5 years of internal exile, forced exile, in one of the coldest regions of Siberia, in Yakutia, where some of the coldest temperatures ever recorded in history were part of Yakutia, minus 60 to minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit. 5 years in those. Now, he will not serve 5 years because Mikhail Gorbachev came into power about 1987, and he gave clemency to dissidents and allowed them to return back to Moscow. I have to tell you, though, one line at the end of that trial I'll never forget. The judge at the end gave him a moment. She said, Valenza was her name, would you like to have a few moments to express regret for what you've done? His reply was, no, I'm not going to express regret. I'm not going to express regret for telling the truth. She said, okay, well, did you then like just a few final words to say anything? What she thought she would get was this. She was emotional. She said, well, what she expected would be that he would tearfully express remorse or forgiveness, ask for forgiveness. What he said was this: thank God for the fate he has given me. That comes out, I think, of Psalm 103, something like that, close to it. The KGB just hounded him, and in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, of course, the KGB's influence on the church remained very strong. It remains strong today. This is a long-winded answer, but let me tell you one other thing that's pretty important, at least I think. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Boris Yeltsin became the leader of the then now called Russia. And Boris Yeltsin said that we're going to open the KGB archives. They've never been opened before to outsiders. Gleb Yakunin was on a small committee allowed to examine those archives. So he went into them with a fellow journalist named Alexander Nizhny, very, very young and very energetic journalist. They stayed in the archive night and day. They knew that they would be closed at any moment, that this was an unusual opportunity to look at these materials. What he discovered in those archives was shocking to him, although he suspected it all along. What he discovered in the KGB archives was a very tight connection between the upper echelon leaders of the Orthodox Church and also the KGB. Orthodox Church leaders had code names like Apteker or so forth, Trostov. What he discovered was that these code names belonged to key members of the church itself. That still, I think, to some extent exists today, that collaboration between them. Those notes that Yakunin took, in part, are right over there on the third floor of the library on this campus, and one can look at them. Tremendous treasure on this campus. Baylor has them. Anyway, thanks to lots of people, Michael Bordeaux, Sanya Denon right here, to others who made that possible. Did that answer your question? Okay.
Yes.
There's more,
It
but I
did.
won't say it.
So in the book, you do a great job talking about his public life, but you also teased with a slide there his private life. And I'm interested in you talking about his wife and his children.
Sure.
Resistance or support of his activities?
Let me see if I can retrieve from the floor.
It was a humbling exercise.
If you expected perfection, you will never get it from me. Right there. That's not a good picture. It's a very old picture. But if you take a look at this picture, you can see On the left side, the far left screen, there's his daughter, Maria, very kind to me, very kind. And then there's his son, Alexander. Alexander lives outside of Washington, D.C. He immigrated from the Soviet Union because he did not want to fight in the war with Ukraine. To serve in the military, Soviet military. And then Anna, who's on the baby there on the right side. And then Ida, his wife. Now, did they support him? I asked that question of Maria. If you don't mind a personal story, a friend gave me her telephone number one night in Moscow, and I called her. Look, what harm is that going to do to call her? So I called her, and she said, I'll be glad to talk to you. Why don't you meet me in the subway station, Professorsky, I believe the name was. So I did. And she said, do you think you could walk 3 or 4 blocks? Of course. So she took me to her home, took me in this room. She's an icon painter. There were icons all around the wall of her studio. It was 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock at night in Moscow. And she said, just ask me anything you want. And I asked her that question. She said, I always loved my father because he did what was right. Now, I'm not sure about the mother, Ida. I've heard various stories about her. But I corresponded with her, and she always answered my questions to her. So there are all kinds of stories here. I'll omit them here. Some of them are in the book that I wrote. But amazing family. And so my overall impression is that they were supportive, almost totally supportive. This family the children were harassed at school all the way through as the children of a dissident. Very difficult for them. The mother also was ostracized at her work. She was a bookkeeper, so she made the money for the family. The family also received help from friends. And that really was part of his story. He knew that what he was doing would come down on his family, but his family encouraged him, and it came down on them, of course, heavily in very different ways. I can only admire them.
Thank you, Dr. Daniel. One question that you hinted at the end there, I wish you'd explore a little further is, this story that you're writing is coming into a particular moment in time. It's a particular moment in time nationally for us, for Putin's Russia, and talk a little bit about its importance that you see for this moment in time as we read Father Gleb's story.
I was hoping you'd ask me about Ukraine, and we can get further into that if you want to. But let me just say, in trying to respond to your question, we're dealing, I don't know if this is said too many times, it needs to be said a lot. We're dealing with the greatest land battle since World War II in Ukraine. The greatest land battle since World War II, the largest. Yakunin is very much admired in Ukraine, very much. I was just on a conference that was held in Israel. We did it over Zoom, in which there were a lot of it was focused on Gleb Yakunin. There were a lot of Ukrainian scholars at this conference, and I only heard words of admiration for him in Ukraine. In terms of the influence and impact on Ukraine today, on the war today, we've got to talk about Putin in order to talk about the war. I'll just tell you my prejudice right now. I'm not an admirer of Vladimir Putin at all. Some are, as you know, but that's not me. I think that he is not intent on giving up. He does need some form of peace treaty. Let me tell you why. Inflation in Russia today is somewhere between 30 and 40%. Think about that. Butter is so scarce that grocery stores are having to put butter under lock and key in order to keep people from stealing butter. It's that scarce as it is. The labor shortage in Russia is very strong. It's very strong. It needs labor. There's a large labor shortage. Between 700,000 and 1 million young men and women have either been severely wounded or have been killed. Many Ukrainians have been killed, as you know. So a peace treaty of some sort without giving up Ukraine, without Ukraine having to, Russia's going to have to give up. Ukraine is going to have to give up something. But remember that, and I think I have the statistic right, I believe this is a war that began in 2014. It did not begin in 2022, as some people said. It began in 2014 when the Russian army, soldiers went into Ukraine and took part of its territory. That led to the Maidan incident in 2014, this huge uproar, huge demonstration in Kyiv. Today, if you took the map today and compared it to 2014 and what the territory Russia took, there's very little difference between what they've taken today and what they had in 2014. Very little difference. And frankly, I shouldn't say give them the territory. That would be too controversial. But they're going to have concessions, and Russia is going to have to give up as well. Ukraine needs security guarantees. Putin so far has been unwilling to do that. My view is that our president needs to put some pressure on Putin, but that's a personal political view. You may not hold that view, but I do. There's more to that question, but I'll stop
You
there.
navigated that question really well. Everyone's going to go to the reception. You could have thinned out the reception a little bit, depending which way you went with that question. I promised some time for you to ask any questions that you might have, so I'll open it up to the audience right now if you have questions, and we have a mic to amplify you so we can both hear your question. Any questions out there?
Hear me? You know, we have our system of government. All the different countries have their own. Over its history, why do you think Russia tends to autocracy?
That's a very good question. It's a very complex question. I think some of it is because of geography, geopolitics. If you look at the map, Russia is in a very difficult geographical situation in that it has no protective borders on either side, like the United States has, or that other countries may have. That question of why over and over and over again, here's the problem. Here's the big problem Russia has, and this is not my answer. It's a historian named Stephen Kotkin, whom I really admire. Here's Russia's problem, and it occurs over and over again in its history. First of all, Russia thinks it's exceptional. It's religiously exceptional. This goes all the way back to the beginning to its concept of the third Rome, that the first two Romes have fallen, the third will never fall. You know, that's an old medieval concept that is repeatedly comes back over and over. But exceptional in lots of ways. Exceptional morally to the West. The West, which is declining, it's always been declining. It's secular. We're not secular. We're religious as it is. That has exceptions to it too. But here's the problem. Russia always in its history has always thrived when it's been associated with Europe, when it's traded with Europe, when it's been open to Europe, when Europe has influenced itself culturally. Now, those two elements are in conflict. And what's happened repeatedly is that after a period of Westernization and Western relations, Russia's drawn back into that other concept. And rulers have emerged that have cut Russia off from the West and have embraced their own power and brought power into itself and served as dictators. There are lots of, not dictators, but of strong leaders. There are many reasons for that. Sometimes the threat of war, sometimes they're because of their own militarization, sometimes for other reasons. But those cycles keep happening. And as I said, for it to really thrive in the future, it has to figure out where it can become open to Europe again, as it has several times in its past. If that happens, we'll have a different kind of country. That's a very simple answer to a very complex question.
It's hard for a master teacher to give a short answer like that, but I appreciate the question. Yes, over here. Oh, right here.
Dr. Daniel Wallace,
Yes,
I
ma'am.
have wanted to ask you this question for many years, and it dates from one of those wonderful times, the 40 years that Jim was in the history department, where we were invited to a dinner. The history department had the greatest guests from all over. And this one was actually a British guest, but at that dinner, a small group of us, Betsy, it was your husband, Dr. Vardaman, who turned over to you, Wallace, and said, Wallace, do you have any prognostications, my noun, about what's happening in Russia, bringing you into the conversation? And I will never forget this, because here's what you told us. You brought up a guy's name, we'd never heard of him, not one person at that table. You said, well, we should be watching out for this new young guy, and his name is Gorbachev. And we had none of us had ever heard of him, but we talked about it for days after that. And I have wanted to ask you all this time, because we had hope for Gorbachev, what happened?
With Gorbachev? Gorbachev, of course, evolved into power beginning in 1987. He is not held in high esteem by many Russians, Russian nationalists particularly, for giving up Eastern Europe and for ending the Cold. You know, Gorbachev did an amazing thing, in my view, and again, I'm an admirer there, you can probably figure that out. He ended the Cold War without a war itself. That's an amazing accomplishment that happened. He's going to be, he made some mistakes, he maybe overreached. You don't revolutionize a country overnight, and that's what he tried to do, essentially. That doesn't happen. It has to evolve slowly, and that depends on your society a lot of the times. He's going to be the victim of an upsurge of resentment against what he had done, and that resentment is going to come with the rise of Russia, Russian nationalism, of Russian statehood. And that happened between 1990 and 1991, to where the Soviet Union will be abolished, and Russia will become the country itself. What happened after that, why the rise of Vladimir Putin, is another story. That's part of it too. If I go into that story, I'll take the next 2 hours, but I think that's probably enough of an answer.
All right, thank you. We've got time for one more question.
Michael.
Thanks for being here. I wondered if you could, I know that Gleb Yakunin was a very big influence on dissidents in other countries of the East Bloc. I was wondering, I hope that you talk about this in the book. I wondered if you could give us a little insight into his influence on other people who are struggling in different countries of the East Bloc.
Michael, you probably can answer that question better than I can, but since that's your specialty. But what I would say quickly and in a very poor way is that the influence on Ukraine is very large. That's what I know, and that's what is in the book. On Eastern European countries, I don't know a great deal about that, and I'm glad you pointed that out, that there has been, and maybe that's a future project, but I don't want to pretend to be something I'm not and just guess at it. If you want to say a few words about that, you'd be welcome to. Okay.
More books. I just heard more books is what I heard.
I want to do something on Henry Dakin of San Francisco, this entrepreneur who, I mean, he's amazing, and he's not known. He's really not known at all much outside of California, but he is an amazing person. And to take these microfilm, he went to Harvard, majored in physics, came back and worked in San Francisco, and then inherited a fortune. And rather than give this a fortune away, trying to make more money, he gave it away to people. And he got interested in Russia, and he was interested in Yakunin. And that story is really remarkable too. Finally, Yakunin came to the United States, made this tour of the United States, and showed up at his door one day. His wife told me that, that is Henry Dakin's wife, told me that when he saw Yakunin, he just like looking at a long-lost friend, threw his arms around him, welcomed him, thought it was one of the great moments in his life. His story needs to be told. Don't you tell it. I want to tell it.
Well, we'll nail down the room 2028. I'll be back. Wallace will be back with his new book on Henry Dakin. Fantastic. Kathy, if you want to come up. Let's thank Dr. Daniel again, please.
Thank you so much, Dr. Daniel. And we're going to let you go ahead and go down for the book signing, so you will not be stopped by each one of these people to talk. So let's get him down there, and then you can buy a book. And if you buy a book, you get to talk to him. But thank you, Wallace and Stephen, for a very thoughtful and thought-provoking experience. Now, Wallace talked a little bit about Gleb Yakunin's family. I'm going to talk just a minute about his while he's gone. We're delighted that his wife, Carol, is here. Now, I did not have the privilege of having Wallace in class, although I was a student at Baylor when he taught here. But his wife, Carol, did have him in class. And I, too, will vouch for that. And I do know that they did not date until after she graduated. So they were very, very careful not to do that. And their son, Zach, or do you go by Zachary now? Their son, Zach, is with us, and his wife, and their 4 children. Okay, now I asked one of them coming in if they had ever heard their grandfather talk, and was he boring? And they said, no, they had never heard him talk. I hope you don't think he was boring. But perhaps. They won't admit it if they did. We also are very grateful to them for coming, and we're grateful for the co-sponsors of the lecture and the reception, the History Department, Religion, Modern Languages and Cultures, International Studies, and of course, the Baylor University Libraries. Now, there will be a reception and book signing downstairs, and thanks to the generosity of the Baylor Bookstore and of the Daniel family, you will be able to purchase your book for $20. So be sure and say thank you for that as well. When I think about Father Gleb Yakunin, Jesus' words in Matthew 10:26 through 28 come to mind. So do not be afraid of them, for there is nothing concealed that will not be revealed, or hidden that will not be made known. What I tell you in the darkness, speak in the light, and what is whispered in your ear, proclaim from the housetops. Go downstairs and enjoy yourselves. Thank you for coming.